In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Adorable Will, I want to pray these titles, but I am unable to do it. Come and do it with me, and I'll do everything well. Jesus and Mary, I cherish you and I love you. One with Luisa, whose work is great and long, and who has much to do in Jesus' endless boundaries. Luisa, who Jesus wanted to find in all created things, as though spread within each one of them. Luisa, the heart of the earth. Luisa, the mouth of the sea. Luisa, the arms of the sun. Luisa, the feet of the wind. Luisa, little daughter of Jesus' will. Luisa, one who has the eyesight to be able to recognize what belongs to the divine will itself. Luisa, one in whom possessing the divine will receives all the fullness of the goods of Jesus' life. Luisa, one who concurs in Jesus' conception and in the carrying out of his whole life and receives all the goods it contains. Luisa, one who already knew the celestial fatherland belonged to her, knew the beauty, the sumptuousness, the happiness of the eternal city. Luisa, whose soul had no circumference of place or space. Luisa, who immersed herself into the very endless light of her Creator. Luisa, who is free to go into the sea, the air, everywhere. Luisa, the soul filled to the brim with the goods of the divine Fiat. Luisa, the soul who has dominion over herself. Luisa, little daughter of Jesus' will, who the divine will keeps in its own properties, in its light, free and dominating. Luisa, the little daughter of Jesus' will. Luisa, creature prey to waves of light. Luisa, creature drowned by love. Luisa, creature invested and embellished by sanctity. Luisa, one who lives in the unity the divine will possesses. Luisa, one who lives within the immense, gigantic waves the unity possesses. Luisa, one who takes everything by living in the unity of the divine will. Luisa, Jesus' little daughter. Luisa, the soul in whom Jesus laid all the knowledges about the kingdom of the divine will as the foundation. Luisa, who Jesus took possession of, laying his very life within her in order to have his true kingdom. Luisa, creature transfused and identified with her Creator. Jesus and Mary, I love you and glory to my Creator. One with Luisa, the soul who is constituted Queen of Sanctity. Luisa, the soul who is constituted Queen of Love. Luisa, the soul who is constituted Queen of Beauty. Luisa, the soul who is constituted Queen of Light. Luisa, the soul who is constituted Queen of Goodness. Luisa, the soul who is constituted Queen of Grace. Luisa, the soul who is constituted Queen of the divine life and of all its qualities. Luisa, who the Supreme Being calls to give her their incessant act. Luisa, who receives the fulfillment of the Supreme Being's will in the solemn act of issuing their generative breath to generate the creatures. Luisa, Jesus' little daughter. Luisa, the soul who acts under the reflection of the eternal and immense Son of the divine Fiat. Luisa, one who can form many sons. Luisa, in whose acts flow an act of divine life, a creative strength that has the virtue of forming sons that are never extinguished. Luisa, one who does not descend from her origin. Luisa, one who everything was created for, and all the goods of creation are hers. Luisa, one who, living in the supreme Fiat, is due the state of queen. Luisa, a queen who lives in the royal palace of the Supreme Being's will. Luisa, a queen who possesses kingdoms, sons, heavens, seas, and the King himself lives life together with her. Luisa, everything is hers. Luisa, like first act before God. Luisa, one who finds herself in the divine will's one act, and as first before the adorable majesty. Luisa, who the cross matured like a beautiful fruit. Luisa, in whom the cross formed Jesus. Luisa, In the depth of her soul, Jesus formed the kingdom of his divine will. Luisa, who Jesus taught the ways of his divine will. Luisa, who Jesus taught the life she was to conduct in the divine will. Luisa, who Jesus taught the prodigies, the power, and the beauty of his kingdom. Luisa, daughter who is all alone with Jesus, and Jesus is all alone with her. Luisa, in whom Jesus centralizes all of himself. Luisa, who Jesus can fill completely with himself, in who he takes his place. Luisa, who is transformed into Jesus, and the extraordinary grace enters into her. Luisa, in whom Jesus is free to do whatever he wants. Luisa, with whom Jesus does great things and performs so many loving stratagems. Luisa, in whom Jesus centralizes his whole life. Luisa, who Jesus calls into the midst of his works in all creation. Luisa, in whom Jesus formed the model. Luisa, who must form the third model in creation. Luisa, who must make the kingdom of the divine will return. Jesus and Mary, I glorify you and I praise you, one with Luisa, whose duties are great. Luisa, on whose models all those of others will be modeled. Luisa, whose littleness sits at the Supreme Being's table, nourishing itself from their supreme volition. Luisa, whose littleness smiles in the Supreme Volition's face. Luisa, whose littleness takes the Supreme Being's joys to deposit in herself their riches and embellish herself with their beauties. Luisa, who would want to put heaven and earth upside down to ask Jesus for his fiat, to render the whole human family happy with her same happiness. Luisa, by whose thoughts, words, hands, feet, heart, Jesus' divine volition feels called. Luisa, who the divine colors and light gives so much beauty that it is an enchantment to see her. Luisa, with whom the whole of heaven would want to enjoy the beauties that the Fiat invested in her soul. Luisa, Jesus' daughter, his little daughter. Luisa, little daughter of Jesus' will, who will always be in the divine will's arms. Luisa, who Jesus loves and in whose acts he sees his fiat having primacy. Luisa, Jesus' little daughter, in whom his divine will is safe. Luisa, Jesus' little daughter of his divine will, who in all created things looks at the veils that hide the divine will, tears the veils and finds it reigning in all creation. Luisa, who kisses, adores, loves the divine will, follows its acts, placing herself as its cortege. Luisa, who gives the divine will the first act in her acts. Luisa, one who gives the divine will its divine honors. Luisa, one who esteems the divine will as the king of everything and receives the goods of her Creator as things that belong to her. Luisa, daughter whose petitions all of heaven echoes, and the angels, saints, the sovereign queen repeat among themselves, Fiat, Fiat, voluntas tua, on earth as it is in heaven. Luisa, who carries the whole of the divine works before the divinity, and with the power of the divine fiat that she possesses, makes all the blessed ask for the kingdom so holy. Luisa, who had the power that no one else had until now to ask for the kingdom of the divine fiat with such power and empire. Luisa, one who lets herself be dominated by the divine will, and by virtue of it receives the divine fecundity. Luisa, one who, with the divine fecundity, can generate in others what she possesses. Luisa, one who, with the divine fecundity, forms the most beautiful and long generation that will bring her the glory, the cortege of having many births generated in her very acts. Luisa, one who sees coming out from within herself the generation of the children of light, of happiness, of divine sanctity. Luisa, one who knows the importance of the kingdom of the divine fiat, and will not spare sacrifices in order to impetrate for others the good that she possesses. Luisa, one who knows the secrets and the ways she must follow. Luisa, one who will make herself importunate in order to conquer God Himself. Luisa, one who is like sun that keeps the fullness of its light within itself, feels the need to spread it outside, to give light to all and do good to all, and render them happy of its own happiness. Luisa, one who possesses the good of asking for the kingdom and of giving it. Luisa, one who possesses the divine life and asks by right. Luisa, one who is the owner, the queen who can be given the kingdom. Luisa, one who is queen and has her divine empire before God to be able to impetrate the kingdom for creatures. Luisa, one who is able to move God. Luisa, little daughter of Jesus' divine will. Luisa, daughter of Jesus' will. Luisa, the soul in whom the divine will enters, dominates and carries out its life within, fully divine. Luisa, the soul in whom the divine will forms its life of light, of peace, of sanctity, of happiness, and she feels its goods as her own properties. Jesus and Mary, I praise you and I thank you, one with Luisa, for whom Jesus' love is so great that for every act she does, the divinity surrenders a divine right to her soul, right of sanctity, of light, of grace, of happiness, which binds her soul and renders her possessor of divine goods. Luisa, one who lives in the triune God's house and uses their goods to glorify them and make them happy. Luisa, at whose acts the triune God places their signature, writing the deed of the donation of their goods to make her happy and rich of their own happiness. Luisa, each of her acts in the divine will is a divine signature that circulates, which assures that the divine will is hers and that she belongs to it. Luisa, daughter, born not once but twice, the first time like the other creatures, the second time she was regenerated in Jesus' will. Luisa, since she is birthed from the divine will, all that belongs to it is hers. Luisa, who the divine will regenerated and endowed with its divine properties. Luisa, in whom Jesus keeps manifesting the knowledges about the divine will, sowing its seed into her soul and preparing the soil and development of the seed. Luisa, creature who, by making the human volition die, produces the seed of the divine Fiat. Luisa, creature who, by giving the divine will, life, and dominion within herself, will restore what creatures lost and will form their salvation, sanctity, and happiness. Luisa, Jesus' daughter, who is worth more than anything, and putting everything aside, Jesus will look at her value and will dispose his kingdom in the midst of creatures. Luisa, one alone who Jesus trusted to place in her the whole value of that good that he wants to give to creatures. Luisa, beloved daughter of Jesus' divine volition. Luisa, whose acts acquire the value of a divine life. Luisa, who the manifestations and knowledges about the divine will are centralized in, like rays inside their sphere. Luisa, all good will descend through her by virtue of the sphere of the divine will that Jesus placed in her. Luisa, all glory will ascend through her by virtue of the sphere of the divine will that Jesus placed in her. Luisa, creature chosen for a mission that must bring universal good into the midst of the human family. Luisa, chosen one who must contain all the superabundant good that others must receive. Luisa, chosen one who possesses more than what all others together should possess. Luisa, chosen to be the first, disposed to give and sacrifice her life for the good of her other brothers. Luisa, the one called to live in the divine will, who must reflect herself in the creation. Luisa, one who was to do and possess the divine will, who, after his mama, Jesus fixed his other gaze on, while coming out of the womb of his mama. Luisa, chosen one, entrusted as the celestial queen was, because the divine will was in them. Luisa, who Jesus looks at, protects and defends. Luisa, the soul who receives from the divine will the shape of the beautiful works, ordered and solid, with the imprint of the life of the divine Fiat in each work. Luisa, whose soul is a beautiful field, invested by suns of the knowledge of the divine will. Luisa, whose soul transformed completely into a divine field. Luisa, whose divine field all of heaven was enamored by, and felt its happiness being doubled in looking at it. Luisa, in whose field Jesus sows the seeds of light, so that in germinating, new sons of the knowledges of his will come out. Luisa, in whom Jesus is always working. Luisa, whose soul is the place in which Jesus deposited his knowledge. Luisa, whose soul became for Jesus his divine field. Luisa, whose soul became for Jesus his throne. Luisa, whose soul became for Jesus his altar. Luisa, to whom Jesus made so many manifestations on his will, as to impearl her as more than a heaven with many sons of his will. Luisa, creature whose acts in the unity of the divine will acquire divine characters. Luisa, whose littleness rises in the unity of the one divine act. Jesus and Mary, I thank you and I esteem you one with Luisa, who puts the divinity in feast, and they feel the happiness and the joy of having created the creation. Luisa, who brings the divinity, the whole creation on her lap, giving them the glory and requital of love for its having been created by them. Luisa, one from man's stock, in whom the triune God renews the solemnity of the creation of the first man. Luisa, creature who is placed in the midst of the huge waves of God's love, with whom they renew the great prodigy of the first act of creation. Luisa, creature who the divine love calls and centralizes in her the whole work of creation. Luisa, who the divine love pours upon, like pouring rain, and overflows with its divine qualities. Luisa, second daughter, queen, who forms the foundation of the kingdom of the divine will, to have the retinue of the triune God's children, all kings and queens. Luisa, in whom Jesus operates the first act of creation. Luisa, in whom Jesus keeps his gaze fixed and forms the kingdom of the divine will. Luisa, who Jesus called first in realizing the purpose of creation, which is the kingdom of the divine will. Luisa, who Jesus centralized everything in, knowing that everything will be inherited by those who follow her. Luisa, to whom Jesus manifested the so many surprising truths. the promises of the many goods that he must give to the children of the Fiat voluntas tua. Luisa, poor daughter, whose martyrdom of the privation of Jesus is from the divine will that martyrs her. Luisa, the divine will's little daughter. Luisa, creature in whom the divinity chose to deposit their work. Luisa, who Jesus called even from the time of redemption. Luisa, in whom Jesus deposited what regarded the kingdom of the supreme Fiat. Luisa, who Jesus gives the gift of his tears. Luisa, who Jesus gives the gift of the word of his will. Luisa, who Jesus gives the gift of the steps of the divine will. Luisa, who Jesus gives the gift of the works of the divine will. Luisa, who Jesus gives the gift of his prayer to impetrate the kingdom of the divine will for the human family. Luisa, who Jesus gives the gift of the miracle of his will. Luisa, who Jesus gives the sight of his will. Luisa, who Jesus gives the gift of acquiring the hearing of his will. Luisa, from whom Jesus loosens the muteness in his will. Luisa, who Jesus straightens up in his will. Luisa, whose storm of human will Jesus commands to not dare to agitate the Pacific Sea of his will. Luisa, to whom Jesus gives everything as gift in order to deposit in her the kingdom of his will. Luisa, creature who receives the restoration of the kingdom of the divine Fiat. Luisa, chosen one Jesus found from the centuries, and directed and deposited his acts in her in order to dispose his kingdom. Luisa, in whom Jesus secures everything. Luisa, whose coming upon earth in time was awaited by Jesus with such love and such yearnings. Luisa, in whom Jesus deposited the many suspended acts done by his humanity to form the kingdom of the supreme Fiat. Luisa, who Jesus made right what regards his will, doctrine all of heaven. Luisa, through whom Jesus transmitted the characters of the celestial fatherland to creatures, that will bring the life of heaven into their midst. Luisa, who was willing to receive Jesus' lessons and make the sacrifice of writing under his dictation. Luisa, who Jesus kept on the cross and sacrificed. Jesus and Mary, I esteem you and I honor you, one with Luisa. Everything she does is nothing but the echo of Jesus resounding in her. Luisa, who Jesus makes present each of his acts, pains, tears, steps to her. Luisa, little daughter of Jesus' will, who echoes all his acts and places them around Jesus like an army. Luisa, Jesus' little daughter, whose littleness was such attraction as to draw the attention of all heaven. Luisa, little girl who causes amazement and surprise. Luisa, tiny little one. Luisa, on whom the divine gaze and the gaze of heaven fixes. Luisa, who gathers all the works of the divine will and wages the holy war on her Creator to make him surrender his kingdom. Luisa, whose hurrying and gathering everything is the true smile of heaven. Luisa, whose hurrying and gathering everything is the new feast that her littleness brings to the celestial fatherland. Luisa, tiny little one, who all await her assault at the Creator. Luisa, one who enters into the divine will's kingdom as the new conqueror of the unity of Jesus' divine Fiat. Luisa, who has a mutual accord with the divinity. Luisa, called to the first act of creation. Luisa, whose duty is to make up for that unity lost by man. Luisa, given the gift of the divine will to know and transcribe the most beautiful prerogatives of the kingdom of the divine Fiat. Luisa, who brings to the triune God the joy of their accomplished works. Luisa, in whom Jesus and the celestial Mama could hear their echo. Luisa, Jesus and the celestial Mama's tiny little one. Luisa, who must enclose all that is holy and good in order to prepare Jesus' kingdom for creatures. Luisa, who by dint of pains must consume all evils to make the divine will be born again in the midst of creatures. Luisa, Jesus' echo. Luisa, in whom Jesus must form the deposit from which the kingdom of the divine Fiat must arise. Luisa, whose presence terrorizes the enemy, and he takes flight so as not to see her. Luisa, poor little one of Jesus, in whom the divine will wants its first place. Luisa, one who can say the sun, the heavens, the sea, everything is hers. Luisa, one who brings everything around the divine majesty to give him the glory that each created thing contains. Luisa, nothing other than a birth from the divine will, and has all rights over all the births from it. Luisa, the soul who carries out the divine life within herself. Luisa, everything that comes out of her contains power, immensity, light, love. Luisa, in whom the divinity feels their bilocating power. Luisa, who bilocates the divinity, placing all their divine qualities in attitude. Luisa, who offers the divine qualities to the divinity as her own, as divine homages, worthy of the divine fiat. Luisa, poor little daughter of Jesus. Luisa, bearer of a good. Luisa, in whom Jesus centralizes the kingdom of his will. Luisa, who the light of the divine will disposes to receive all the truths necessary to form its kingdom. Luisa, the depository. Jesus and Mary, I honor you and I cherish you. One with Luisa, who rises to the same unity that Adam left and takes his place. Luisa, who places herself in the origin of everyone and of everything, and encloses within herself the very acts of Adam, with the whole retinue of all the acts of creatures. Luisa, the origin of all. Luisa, from her descends everything, just as everything descends from the divine fiat. Luisa, the thought, the word, the work, and the step of all. Luisa, who takes everything and brings everything to her Creator. Luisa, in whom the divine will's life and knowledges are to make known what divine will means.
You have reached the end of day 21 of the titles of Luisa. Fiat.